The Ardenvast had been refusing people for longer than I had been alive. That was the first thing they told you when you hired on with Delvern Salvage. Longer than your father had been alive. Longer than your grandfather. 411 years since the colony fleet dropped out of transit above Kethara, and the flagship simply sealed herself, locked her airlocks, shuttered her intake bays, and went dark while every other ship in the fleet either landed, burned in on re-entry, or sat dead in orbit until their hulls gave way to vacuum and time. The other 12 ships had been stripped and processed over the centuries, their metal reused, their systems catalogued, their stories told in the thin archive building at Kethara Station. But the Ardenvast had never been opened. No one knew why she had sealed. No one knew what was inside. The scans that could be done from the outside, which was all anyone had ever managed, showed a hull 1,700 meters long and 400 meters at the widest beam, a planetary-class colony ship that dwarfed everything else the fleet had brought, and at her center, behind 6 layers of alien alloy shielding that bounced every probe and scan attempt, something that the station archive's oldest entry called the Founding Core. That was all the entry said. Founding Core. No further detail. The woman who had written it had died on Kethara Station 4 years after landing, and whatever she had known about the Ardenvast and her purpose had died with her. I had been hired to clear the approach field. That was the job. Nothing glamorous. Delvern Salvage held the surface contract on the Boneyard, a flat 2-kilometer clearing the colony ships had used as a landing zone, now littered with debris. Broken hull panels from the ships that had been stripped, discarded equipment frames, the rusted skeletons of century-old cutting rigs that previous salvage operations had abandoned when they moved on to easier targets. The Ardenvast sat at the back of the clearing like a wall. She had come down hard on landing, or whatever it was called when a ship that was not supposed to land had come down anyway. She sat at a slight angle, her bow tilted about 8 degrees toward the ground, her stern elevated so that her engine nacelles hung above the clearing's rear edge like the blunt arches of a dead cathedral. The metal of her hull had gone the color of old iron over 4 centuries of Kethara's atmosphere, a thin, cold atmosphere, barely enough to breathe without supplementation on the station side, though at the clearing elevation the partial pressure was technically survivable, which was why debris clearing ops were cheaper here than vacuum ops elsewhere. You wore a filter mask and insulated work clothes, and you were fine. The cold was the harder part. Kethara had no active seasons, no working water cycle, no weather to speak of. Just wind. The wind came off the western plateau every morning and went nowhere in particular, carrying dust that had been carrying for centuries with nowhere to deposit. I had been on Kethara 6 weeks. Contract ran 12. The pay was enough. My name was Soren Vale. I was 31 years old. I had worked debris clearing, equipment retrieval, and demolition prep on 9 different worlds over the past 8 years, mostly dead or near-dead worlds, where the cost of human labor was low enough to make manual clearing competitive against machine ops. I was good at it. I had no particular feelings about the work. You got up before the light if there was a light, you moved material from one place to another, or you broke it down into components that could be moved. You ate what the company provided at the end of a shift. You slept. Some of the worlds were beautiful in a cold way. Some were not. Kethara was the latter. The soil was a dark gray-red, fine-grained, and it stuck to everything. The sky was pale orange fatting to white at the zenith, and there were no clouds because there was no water in the air to make them. The Ardenvast stood against that sky every morning when I walked out from the temporary hab unit Delvern had set up at the clearing's edge. And she was, I had decided by the end of the first week, the most impressive thing I had ever seen. Not beautiful, impressive. There is a difference. Beauty requires something soft at its core, some invitation. The Ardenvast had no invitation in her. She was massive and closed and utterly indifferent to the fact that I was standing in front of her. 4 centuries of wind had scoured her hull plating to a dull, matte finish that absorbed the pale morning light rather than reflecting it. Her intake bays, 3 of them visible on the starboard side from where I worked, were sealed so completely that you could not see the seam of the doors unless you were close and looking for it. Her running lights had gone dark 400 years ago and never come back on. The survey teams that had tried to board her over the centuries had tried everything. Cutting through the hull plating, the alloy resisted every cutting tool anyone had brought to Kethara, attempting to interface with her external access panels. The panels were sealed beneath a secondary layer of hull material that had apparently grown over them, which the station archive described as a defensive measure the ship had taken deliberately, and on one occasion 40 years ago. Simply drilling from underneath through the soil and trying to breach her keel from below, the drill had hit the hull and stopped, and when the crew tried to extract the drill, the bit had sheared off flush against the hull's surface, as though the ship had simply decided it was not going to allow penetration from that vector either. The station archive had a long section on the Ardenvast. All of it was attempts and failures. None of it was entry. I cleared debris for 5 weeks. It was good work in the sense that it was straightforward. The equipment frames were the worst of it, big enough to require the cutting rig to section them, and the section pieces still needed to be dragged by hand to the loading area where Delvern's collection crawler would pick them up on its weekly run. The hull panels were easier, lighter alloy, and most of them had been cut from the stripped ships in standard-size sections that could be stacked and handled without the rig. By the end of week 5, I had cleared a clean path from the HAB unit all the way to the base of the Ardenvast's hull, which had not been part of the original contract scope. Delvern's work order said clear the approach field to within 50 meters of the ship, to keep the operations safely away from the hull in case of a collapse event, which was a real consideration with a ship that old. But I had cleared it because the debris on the hull's immediate perimeter was heavy, and I had gotten into the rhythm of the work, and I had not wanted to stop 20 meters short of the base. The HAB supervisor, a thin woman named Osrin Gallic who ran contract compliance from the station and came down to the clearing once a week, had noted the overage in her log and had not said anything further about it. The extra footage had been done on my own time, after the daily quota was logged. That was how I ended up standing at the base of the Ardenvast's hull on the morning of the 39th day. I had come out early. The wind was quieter than usual. The plateau weather ran in 3-day cycles, and today was the low-wind day, which made for better working conditions but also made the clearing feel strange, because the wind was so constant that its absence had a quality to it, a thickness, like the silence between 2 heartbeats. The pale morning light was coming over the eastern ridge. The Ardenvast's hull rose above me in the gray-red dimness, close enough that I could see the surface detail of her plating, the fine texture of 4-century-old oxidation, the regular grid pattern of the original plating joints just barely visible beneath it, and here and there, along the lower hull, faint markings that might have been characters in a script I did not recognize, or might have been structural stress markings, or might have been something else entirely. The station archive mentioned the hull markings. The section was brief. Linguist teams, it said, had attempted analysis. The markings did not match any known script. Analysis had been inconclusive. I was not there to read the markings. I was there because I had left a hydraulic driver at the base of the hull the previous evening. I had set it down when I stopped for the day and had not gone back for it, and I needed the driver for the morning's work. I walked to where I had left it, picked it up, and turned to go. The hull was 3 feet from my shoulder. I do not know what made me turn back. I have asked myself that question in the years since, and I have no clean answer. Curiosity is the simple version. And it is probably true as far as it goes, but curiosity about what specifically? I had been walking alongside that hull for 2 weeks as I worked the perimeter debris. I had been close to it before. Something was different about the morning, the silence, possibly, or the angle of the early light, or the fact that I was there early and alone without the rhythm of the work to carry me forward. Something made me put my hand out. My palm touched the hull at shoulder height, flat, between 2 of the faded markings. The metal was cold. I had expected that. What I had not expected was the quality of the cold, not the dead cold of inert matter on a freezing morning, but something with a texture to it, a resistance, like pressing against a surface that had some slow and very old tension in it. It was the same feeling as putting your hand against the chest of a large animal that is breathing so slowly you cannot see the movement, but the warmth of life is still there under the fur. I had felt that once as a boy with an old draft animal my uncle kept. I had not thought about it in 20 years. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the hull. The clearing was empty. The wind was quiet. The pale light was strengthening on the eastern ridge. Nothing happened. I turned and walked back toward the hab unit. I had gone perhaps 30 meters when the first sound reached me. It was not a loud sound. It was the opposite of loud. It was the kind of sound that registers in your chest before your ears, a deep harmonic vibration at the lower edge of hearing, the frequency you feel rather than hear. I stopped walking. Behind me, toward the hull, the frequency rose very slightly. I turned around. The Ardenvast was lit. Not brightly, not the sudden illumination of a ship powering on. I had seen ships come online before, and this was not that. This was something much slower and much older. Along the lower edge of the hull, at approximately the height where I had placed my hand, a line of the faded markings had begun to glow. Not glow, that is the wrong word. Become visible. As though they had always been lit at a wavelength I could not see, and now some filter had shifted and they were becoming present, shading into a color that was not quite amber and not quite copper, and was very close to the color of the last light on a distant star. The line ran along the hull for perhaps 60 meters in each direction from the point where I had touched it, and as I watched, it was joined by a second line 10 meters above the first, the same slow luminescence, the same warming from invisible to just visible. I stood in the clearing at 30 meters distance and watched the Ardenvast wake up. It took 12 minutes. I know because I was looking at my work timer when it started, and I checked it when the process appeared to complete. In those 12 minutes, the lower third of the hull, roughly 500 meters of her length, from the bow section to the midship break, acquired a running pattern of lit markings that covered the entire surface in a grid so fine and so regular that from 30 meters away, it looked like a mesh of pale amber light laid over the dark iron of the hull. The sound had grown during those 12 minutes from a subaudible vibration to a deep, clear tone, like a very large bell struck very gently, felt in the teeth and the sternum. And at the end of the 12 minutes, 60 meters to my right, one of the intake bay doors opened. Not fast, not dramatically. The seam I had never been able to see resolved itself with a soft mechanical precision, the two halves of the door drawing back into recesses in the hull on either side with a motion that was entirely unhurried. The gap widened. A pale interior light came from inside, not amber this time, but a cool and steady silver white, the kind of light that suggests a large space and good engineering. The door opened fully. The gap was roughly 4 meters wide and 4 meters tall. From where I stood, I could see the beginning of an interior corridor, clean. 400 years sealed, and the interior was clean, the walls showing no oxidation, no dust accumulation, nothing that suggested any of that time had passed. I stood there for a long moment. Then I walked to the hab unit, put on my full environmental suit, picked up the portable sensor kit, and went back to the door. The corridor was 3 meters wide and 3 meters high. The walls were a composite material I did not recognize, not metal, not the alien alloy of the hull exterior, but something with a slight translucence to it, pale gray, lit from within at a level that made the space feel inhabited even though it was empty. The floor was clean. The air was breathable. The sensor kit confirmed it before I went in, showing a balanced atmospheric mix that made no scientific sense for a ship that had been sealed for 400 years, and made a great deal of sense for a ship that had apparently been doing something very deliberate for 400 years, and had simply not opened her doors to show it. I took 3 steps inside and stopped. The corridor extended ahead of me for a distance I could not see the end of. On both sides of the corridor, at regular intervals of about 10 meters, there were alcoves. In each alcove there was a chair, a contoured seat with arm restraints, designed for a human body, with a small panel on the right armrest and a headrest assembly that included what appeared to be a contact interface at the back. The intake chairs. I had read about them in the station archive. Survey teams that had gotten this far, which had been none of them, because none of them had gotten inside, but the archive had included analysis of scan data and speculation about what the intake bays would contain if they could be accessed. The archive had speculated that the ship's entry protocol involved some kind of identity verification through the intake chairs. The actual entry had never been observed. I was apparently the first person to observe it. The first 8 alcoves were empty. The 9th one was not. I almost missed it. The alcove light was slightly dimmer than the others, not dark, not alarming, just slightly less than full, and the shape in the chair had compressed over the centuries into something that was more impression than presence, the restraints still engaged, the contact interface still seated at the back of what had once been a head. I stood in front of it for a moment. The sensor kit told me what I already suspected: organic remains, significantly desiccated, age consistent with approximately 3 centuries. Someone had gotten into this chair 300 years ago and had not gotten out. There were more. Over the next 400 meters of corridor in the alcoves on both sides, I found 11 more occupied chairs. Some were older than others. The oldest, the sensor kit suggested, might be close to the full 4 centuries, which would put it among the first people who had tried to board after the ship sealed. Some were more recent. The most recent was perhaps 60 years old. Someone had gotten to this chair 60 years ago, sat down, engaged the restraints, and the ship had done something. Not killed them, or not directly. There was no evidence of violence, no trauma to what remained. Whatever the ship had done, it had not opened the door further. I stopped at each occupied alcove for a moment. Not out of ceremony, or not only out of ceremony. The sensor kit read each set of remains as I passed, and I was building a picture. 11 people across 4 centuries who had made it through the exterior door that had never opened for anyone else, had followed the corridor to the intake chairs, had sat down in good faith, and had not walked out. The corridor told a story of accumulated effort, of people who had managed the entry somehow, not the way I had managed it clearly, but had gotten to this point through persistence or chance or some method the archive had not recorded, and who had then encountered the ship's deeper patience and been held there by it. The corridor did not feel like a trap. I want to be precise about that. It felt like what it was, a waiting room that had been waiting too long and had become a record of that waiting. Each occupied chair was a chapter of it. The oldest near the door from the first generation, someone who had been among the first to try in the years just after the ship sealed, and who had perhaps understood the most about what the ship was, and had still not had the key. The most recent near the far end, someone who had come 60 years ago, had gotten this far, had been that close. I stood in front of the most recent one for a longer moment than the others. 60 years ago was within living memory. Someone alive now might have known this person. Might have been waiting for news that had never come, a survey crew that had gone into the boneyard and not returned, a report that had been filed and had cited the standard conclusion for Ardenvast operations. No entry, no change, personnel status unknown. The standard conclusion that the ship was simply impassable, and anyone who tried long enough paid for trying. 60 years of that conclusion sitting in the archive next to 4 centuries of the same conclusion. The corridor light was steady. The script on the walls ran its continuous patient characters. I put my hand on the wall near the final chair, not on the chair itself, just on the wall beside it. I did not know the person's name. I did not know anything about them. I knew they had been here, had been this close, and had not had the peace that would have made the difference. I did not know what to do with that fact except carry it forward. I did not sit in any of the chairs. I walked past them, through the intake corridor, through a set of internal doors that opened ahead of me as I approached, not abruptly, but with the same measured, unhurried motion as the exterior doors, as though the ship were simply making way, and into the main internal structure of the Arden Vast. She was enormous inside. I had known the exterior dimensions from the archive data, but knowing dimensions and standing inside them are different experiences. The main thoroughfare was 12 meters wide, and the ceiling above it was lost in a pale haze of recessed light. On either side of the thoroughfare, deck after deck of internal structure rose into the haze, habitation modules, storage bays, systems enclosures, all of it clean, all of it intact, all of it as still and as preserved as a room that has been sealed against time. There was no dust. There was no rust. There was no sign of 400 years of abandonment except for the silence, and even the silence had a quality of intention to it, a chosen stillness rather than a dead one. The ship was walking me somewhere. I realized this about 3 minutes into the main thoroughfare, when I noticed that every door ahead of me was opening precisely when I needed it to, and every door behind me was closing precisely when I had passed through it. I was not being herded. The movement was too respectful of my pace for that, opening far enough ahead that I never felt constrained. But I was being guided. The path was clear and it led forward, and every time I reached a junction between corridors or between decks, the lit pathway told me which way to go. I followed it. The lit pathway was the hull markings replicated on the interior surfaces. In here, close up, they were unambiguous. They were a script, dense and regular and clearly meaningful, and whatever they said I could not read a single character of it. They lit ahead of me and dimmed behind me, a moving presence in the ship's interior, and they led me deeper toward the center. I passed through what I recognized from the archive's speculative diagrams as the command section, a broad space with tiered workstations arranged in a semicircle facing a primary display array, all of it dark, all of it sealed, none of it inviting entry. I passed through the engineering core's outer ring, a cylindrical space with the ship's primary power systems running in their housings along the curved walls, and the sound I had first felt as a subaudible harmonic was stronger here, a resonance that came up through the deck plates and settled in the bones. I passed through 3 more sets of internal doors, each one heavier than the last, each one opening ahead of me with the same deliberate, unhurried grace. And then I was in the center. The chamber was spherical. I understood that from the curvature of the walls as I came through the final door, though the chamber was large enough, 40 meters across, at least, that the curvature was gentle, and the impression was less of a sphere than of a space that had been designed to feel complete in itself. The floor was slightly recessed at the center, a shallow bowl shape, and at the lowest point of the bowl, on a plinth of material I had not seen elsewhere on the ship, darker than the wall composite, with a texture that suggested it had been cast or grown rather than machined, and with a surface covered entirely in the script markings, layer on layer of them, so many that individual characters were impossible to distinguish, and the overall impression was of a surface that was more writing than material. On that plinth sat the founding core. It was smaller than I expected. Given the ship, given the shielding, given 400 years of failed attempts to reach it, I had built up some image of a monolith, a structure, something as massive as the purpose implied. It was not that. It was a cylinder perhaps 1.5 meters tall and 60 centimeters in diameter, capped at both ends with the same dark plinth material, its sides smooth and unlit. The script on the plinth was lit, had been lit, I realized, for some time, the amber-copper script of the hull exterior running in patterns across the base that were clearly distinct from the denser overlay on the plinth's face, almost as though the plinth were annotating itself. The core itself was dark. I stood at the lip of the bowl for a moment. Then I walked down to the plinth. The script lit under my feet as I descended, not following me exactly, but responding to my presence in the bowl, brightening as I moved toward the center, the characters on the plinth becoming individually legible for the first time, separating from the dense overlay into clear individual lines, though I could no more read them than I could have read them at a distance. I reached the plinth. The founding core was at shoulder height. I could see that the capping material on the upper end was not a solid cap but a contact surface, slightly recessed, slightly textured, the kind of surface designed for a palm. I thought about the 11 occupied chairs. I thought about the 60-year-old remains at the end of the intake corridor. I thought about the survey teams and the drilling crews and the linguists and the 4 centuries of people who had tried, in one way or another, to make this ship open. I put my hand on the contact surface. The core lit. It did not light the way the hull markings had lit, the slow warming from invisible to present, the careful measured progression. The core lit the way a door opens when someone who has been expected for a very long time finally arrives, completely, immediately, without hesitation. Amber copper light came from the cylinder's entire surface simultaneously, bright enough that I had to narrow my eyes, and the sound that had been building since the hull came online. The deep, clear tone, the resonance in the bones, rose through 3 registers in the space of 2 seconds, and then resolved into something that was no longer a simple tone but a chord, multiple harmonics interlocked, and the chord had a quality that I can only describe as recognition. Not a human quality, something older. The quality of a very long calculation arriving at its answer. The entire chamber lit with it. The script on the plinth and walls ran gold. The recessed bowl filled with ambient light from below as well as above, so that there were no shadows anywhere in the space, and the core itself was now incandescent, a sustained bright amber that cast no heat and needed no fuel, and had been waiting for 411 years to do exactly this. Then the ship spoke. The voice was not loud. It came from no single direction, from the walls, from the core, from the air of the chamber, from some combination of all of them that produced a presence rather than a sound source. It was not a human voice, not exactly, too even, too measured, the cadence of something that had thought about what it was going to say for a very long time. It spoke in the script I had been reading on the walls for the past 40 minutes, which I could not understand, and I stood there in the light and the sound, and heard a language I did not know and felt the meaning of it land anyway, not in words but in the clarity that comes after a long and unresolved question finally closes. There are things that translate past language. This was one of them. Then the voice shifted, not to my language, but to a form of it, an older form, the kind you find in documents that predate the current language by 4 or 5 generations, clear enough to follow but weighted differently, the grammar carrying a formality that modern speech had shed. And it spoke 3 words that I heard clearly, that I could not misunderstand, that were not a greeting and not a welcome, but a statement of a fact that had been waiting to be stated. You were made for the surface, Heir. The chamber held that for a moment. I stood with my palm on the core and my eyes adjusting to the light and those 7 words inside me, and I felt the shift that happens when a fact you did not know you were carrying becomes a fact you know. It is not dramatic. That is what I would want to tell anyone who asked. It does not feel like a transformation. It feels like the ground becoming level under your feet after you have been walking at a slight angle for so long you stopped noticing the angle. Something settles. Something that has been compensating for an imbalance stops compensating, because the imbalance is gone. I stood there and let it settle. Then I said, to the core, to the ship, to whatever intelligence had been maintaining itself in the dark for 4 centuries, tell me what that means. And the Ardenvast told me. It took a long time. I did not track the hours. The bowl's floor, I discovered, was designed to accept a seated human. There was a slight shaping to the recessed surface that was not immediately obvious from above, but that made perfect sense once I sat down in it. And I sat for the duration of what the ship told me, with my back to the plinth and the core's light above and around me, and the script running continuously on the walls, as though transcribing what was being said for some future reader. Perhaps it was. Perhaps that was what the script on all the walls of the Ardenvast had always been, not a language the ship spoke to potential boarders, but the ongoing record of what the ship had been built to say when the right person finally came. What I learned was this. The colony fleet that had come to Kethara 411 years ago had not been what its own records said it was. The records, the ones in the station archive, the ones that had been maintained and transmitted back to the origin systems over the centuries, were accurate as far as they went. 12 ships, approximately 14,000 colonists. A standard resettlement operation to a dead world with terraformable characteristics, intended to establish an agricultural and mineral extraction colony over a 200-year development timeline. All of that was true. What the records did not contain, because the records had been composed and maintained by the colony's governance council, which had not been told, was what the Ardenvast was. She was not a transport vessel with incidental cargo. She was the mission. The 12 other ships with their 14,000 colonists, their equipment, their governance structures, their 200-year timeline, they were support. The Ardenvast was the instrument. At her core, in this chamber, in this plinth, in the cylinder of old alloy and patient engineering that had been lit for 30 seconds and dark for 4 centuries, was a terraforming system that had no analog in anything the colony's records described, because it had been designed and built before those records began, by people who had understood the deep structure of planetary systems in ways that the subsequent centuries had not recovered. The system worked through the soil, not through atmospheric seeding or orbital irradiation or any of the other terraforming approaches that subsequent generations had developed and deployed on other dead worlds. Those methods worked, slowly, over centuries, with continuous maintenance and power input, and the constant risk of cascade failure if the infrastructure was interrupted. The Ardenvast system worked through the soil itself. It seeded a network of what the ship's language called in its old form root threads, structures too fine to be detected by any scan, propagating through the planetary crust at the molecular level, restructuring mineral composition, altering subsurface chemistry, rebuilding the conditions for water retention, for atmosphere thickening, for the initiation of a natural weather cycle. Once seeded, the network was self-sustaining. It did not require maintenance. It did not require continuous power. It required only activation. Activation required the core. The core required a single genetic key. The genetic key had been engineered into the founding line, the family line of the woman who had designed the system, who had built the core, who had brought it to Kethara aboard the Ardenvast 411 years ago. Her name, in the ship's language, translated to something close to groundkeeper or surfacetender, the kind of compound word that older languages built from functional roots. She had brought the system to Kethara, had supervised the fleet's arrival, and had then died in the first winter before the activation could be performed. Her children had died in the years following, in the small, ordinary ways that new colonies kill their first generation: illness, accident, the brittleness of a population too stretched and too young to absorb its losses. The genetic key had dispersed into the colony's general population, diluted and forgotten, recessive and silent across generations of intermarriage. The ship had known. The ship had maintained the record. The ship had tracked the key's dispersal through the colony's genetic record as long as the colony had remained on Kethara, until the colony's population had declined past a viable threshold, roughly 300 years ago, and the remaining colonists had evacuated to Kethara Station, off-world, and eventually dispersed into the broader population of the settled systems. The ship had lost direct tracking at that point. But the key did not disappear just because the ship could no longer track it. It was still in the line, somewhere. The ship had waited. The intake chairs were not identity verification in the way the archive had speculated, not biometric checks, not password systems, not credential confirmation. They were genetic sequencing stations. Every person who had ever sat in one of those chairs had been tested against the key pattern. Every single one of them had failed the test, not because they were wrong, but because they were not the right person. The ship had not harmed them. The ship had tested them, confirmed they did not carry the key, and held the result. 11 of them had died in the chairs. The ship had not killed them. The ship had held them in the intake protocol, gentle, unhurried, the same quality of patience it had brought to everything. And something in the protocol had interacted badly with something in some of those 11 people. Old age, existing medical conditions, the stress of a system designed for a much earlier version of human physiology operating on people who had drifted from that baseline over 4 centuries of evolution. The ship expressed regret about this in its old formal language, which translated imperfectly but unmistakably. It had not known it would harm them. It had not intended harm. The protocol had been designed with a care that had not anticipated what 400 years of genetic drift would mean for its boundaries. Then I had touched the hull, not in the intake bay, not in a chair, just my palm flat between 2 markings on a cold morning when the wind was quiet and I had come out early to retrieve a tool I had left behind. The hull had read me through my glove. The insulated work gloves I wore had enough contact permeability for the hull's surface sensors, which were, the ship told me, far more sensitive than anything I would have expected of materials that old, because they had been designed with that sensitivity, maintained in the sealed environment, and had lost nothing to time. The hull had read me through my glove, and the key had been there, clear and unambiguous. The founding line, 4 centuries dispersed but intact, present in the son of a woman who had been born on a resettlement world 2 systems over, whose grandmother had been born on another resettlement world, whose great-grandmother's name appeared nowhere in any surviving record, but whose great-grandmother had almost certainly been among the last generation of colonists to leave Kethara before the population dropped below viability. The Ardenvast had not opened for all the people who had tried. She had opened for me. I sat in the bowl for a long time after the ship finished. The core was still lit. The script was still running on the walls. The deep chord of the ship's active state was still in the air and in the deck plating and in the bones of my hands. I thought about the 11 chairs. I thought about the 60-year-old remains and the 300-year-old remains and the ones that might be as old as the ship's first sealed years, people who had come here and tried. I thought about the 4 centuries of survey teams and their instruments and their reports, all of them true, all of them accurate, all of them looking at the wrong thing. The ship had not been refusing because she was damaged or because her systems had failed or because the entry mechanism was defective. The ship had been waiting because she had something to give, and she was not going to give it to anyone who was not the one she had been built to give it to. I thought about my mother. She had been a transit worker on the resettlement world where I was born, and she had been born there, and her mother before her. None of them had known anything about Kethara. None of them had known anything about a colony fleet or a founding line or a woman whose name meant groundkeeper in a language that had been dead for 3 centuries. My mother had liked soil. That was a thing I remembered about her. She had kept a kitchen garden on the roof of the Hab building where we lived, small containers, whatever would grow in that climate, and she had tended it with a patience that I had not inherited and had not understood as a child. She had just liked the feel of soil. She had said that once when I was very young. I like the feel of it. There's something right about it. I thought about that for a while. Then I got up. The activation sequence, the full sequence, the root thread seeding, the subsurface network initiation was not instantaneous. The ship told me this before she began it, with the same unhurried precision she had brought to everything. It would take time. The root threads would propagate through the planetary crust over a period she could not specify exactly, because it depended on variables in Kethara's subsurface composition that 400 years of sealed dormancy had not allowed her to assess continuously, and she would update me as the process developed. What she could tell me was that the initial seeding phase would complete within the first hour. The visible effects, the first changes to the atmosphere, the first evidence of subsurface water activation, the changes to the sky, would begin within several hours of that. She showed me the bridge. The command section that I had walked through earlier, the tiered workstations, the sealed primary display array, was the bridge, and it was the right place to observe the activation. Not necessary, she said. She would proceed regardless of where I was. But if I wanted to see it, the bridge was where the ship's external sensors reported their data, and I would be able to see what was happening in real time. She did not tell me I should go there. She offered and left the decision with me. I went. The bridge lit for me as I walked in. Not with the amber copper script of the deep systems, but with a cooler, more functional illumination. The workstations coming online, their displays resolving from blank to active, the primary display array ahead of them unlocking from its sealed state and displaying an external view that I stopped walking to look at for a long moment. Kethara, from outside the Ardenvast's hull in real time. The pale orange sky. The dark gray-red soil of the clearing. My own footprints from this morning's walk to the hull, still visible in the fine dust, crossing and recrossing each other between the HAB unit and the base of the ship. The HAB unit itself, a dull green temporary structure at the clearing's eastern edge, with its single work light on above the door because I had left before the light was full and had not turned it off. I sat down in the primary operator's seat, not casually, not carelessly, but because it was the right place for what I was about to do, and because the ship had shown me here and I understood the gesture, and I placed both hands on the primary contact surface of the workstation. The activation sequence began. I felt it through the contact surface first. The same deep harmonic the core had produced, but distributed now, spread through the full structure of the ship, moving outward from the core through the Ardenvast's interior and through the hull and into the ground beneath her. The root thread mechanism propagating through the contact points where her hull met Kethara's surface. The display array showed me what the external sensors read. Nothing visible at first, the clearing unchanged, the pale sky unchanged, the dust on the soil undisturbed. Then the soil directly beneath the ship began to change color, slightly, subtly, from the dark gray-red to something slightly darker, a richer tone, the way soil looks when it has absorbed water. The soil was absorbing water. The root threads were pulling water from the deep subsurface, from aquifers that Kethara's surveys had identified but had never been able to access, too deep, too mineralized, requiring a filtration system that no surface operation had the infrastructure to install. The Ardenvast had the infrastructure, had always had it, had been sitting above those aquifers for 411 years with the means to reach them, waiting for the moment when the right person laid their hands on her and said, in the only language she had been waiting for, yes. The dark circle spread, slowly at first, then with a certainty that felt less like a process gaining momentum, and more like a thing removing an obstacle, not growing, but revealing, as though the gray-red surface of Kethara had always had this darker, richer layer beneath it, and was only now letting it show. After 40 minutes, the dark circle extended beyond what the external sensors could frame directly, and the array shifted to a wider orbital view. The ship had access to orbital sensors I had not known about, positioned above Kethara, presumably placed there in the same founding era that had built everything else. And from orbit, I could see the circle spreading from the ship as its center outward across the southern plain. After 2 hours, the sky changed. The first cloud I saw on Kethara was small, a thin, ragged thing at low altitude, more absence of clarity than actual cloud, the kind of formation that happens when barely sufficient moisture reaches barely sufficient temperature differential, and the result is not quite weather but the memory of weather. It lasted 20 minutes, then there was another one, then 3 more. Then a front of them, building along the western plateau edge where the cold air came from every morning, and the front was moving east across the plain, and the pale orange sky above it was deepening, taking on a weight and a color it had not had this morning or any morning in the years I might have spent on Kethara watching it. Osrin Gallic called on the work radio at hour 3. She was calling from the station. She had seen the readings, she said. The atmospheric sensors on the station were going strange, and she wanted to know if I had any information about an anomaly in the clearing. Her voice had the careful quality of someone who is trying not to ask the question she actually wants to ask. I told her the Ardenvast had opened. There was a long pause. I told her she should probably come down. Another pause. She asked if it was safe. I said yes. She asked carefully what had happened. I told her I had touched the hull and the ship had opened for me, and the ship had been a terraforming instrument, and she had initiated the terraforming sequence, and Kethara was going to have weather by nightfall. Osrin said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "The survey teams have been trying to open that ship for 200 years. I know, I said. You're a debris worker. I know, I said. Another pause, then, I'm coming down. She arrived 90 minutes later. She stood in the doorway of the bridge for a long time without coming in, looking at the display array and the active workstations and the amber copper script running continuously on the walls. And then she looked at me. And I do not know exactly what she saw, but it was enough for her to stop asking the obvious question and instead ask the one that actually mattered. What do you need? I told her what the ship had told me. I told her about the root thread network and the subsurface water and the atmospheric seeding and the timeline the ship had projected. I told her about the founding line and the genetic key and the 11 chairs in the intake corridor. I told her about the woman whose name meant groundkeeper, who had built this and brought it here and died in the first winter before she could use it. I told her that the record the ship had been keeping, the continuous script on the walls, was a 4th-century transcription of everything that had been done to try to reach the core, and everything that the ship had observed about Kethara's changing conditions in the centuries since the colony had left, and everything that the founding line had become as it dispersed through the population of the settled systems. A record of waiting. A record of what had been built and what it was for, and what it was holding, and who it was holding it for. Osrin sat down on the floor of the bridge because there was only one chair and I was in it, and she put her hands on her knees and looked at the display array. Where the clouds were now a continuous front along the western third of the southern plain, and the moisture readings were climbing, and the atmospheric pressure was shifting in patterns the station's models had never recorded for Kethara. She knew you were coming, Osrin said, not a question. She knew someone was coming, I said. Eventually, she built the system to wait. Osrin was quiet for a while. Then, how long for the full cycle, before it's viable, before people can live here? The ship answered before I could, the display array shifting to show a projection. Root thread coverage at full planetary scale within 40 years. Surface water emergence within 12. Atmospheric nitrogen-oxygen balance within 25. Viable agriculture in the southern plain, the area where the founding colony had first settled, where the boneyard now sat, where the Ardenvast rested at her slight angle in the soil within 8 years. 8 years from today. Osrin looked at the projection for a long time. Then she looked at me again, and I think she was looking for something in my face, some sign of how I was carrying what the ship had told me, the weight of a lineage I had not known I had and a purpose I had not known I was built for. I do not know what she found. I know what I felt, which was not small and not large and was mostly the quality of the settled ground I described before. The imbalance resolved, the compensation stopped, the knowledge that I had come to the right place. Not because I had intended to, not because I had known, but because something much older than either of us had been tracking the line across 4 centuries and 400 light-years of dispersal, and had known that eventually, if the line held, the key would come back. The line had held. Outside, through the Ardenvast's external sensors, and on the display array in front of us, the rain began. It was not a heavy rain, not yet. 400 years of dead sky does not open all at once. It opened the way the ship had opened, with patience and precision, a measured thing rather than a sudden one. The first drops hit the soil of the clearing individually, widely spaced, the way rain falls at the very beginning of a storm when the storm is still deciding what it is. The dust absorbed them immediately. The dark circle of activated soil around the ship was several shades darker than it had been this morning, and the first drops vanished into it as though they were arriving home. I watched them fall. The HAB unit's work light was still on above the door. My footprints from this morning were still visible in the dust at the clearing's edge, just above the dark line where the activated soil began. In a few more hours they would be gone, absorbed into something that was already becoming different from what it had been. The rain strengthened as I watched. Not fast, not dramatically, just steadily, the way the true things tend to do, without announcement, without performance, simply more present with every minute that passed. Osrin said, very quietly, "She waited 400 years for a debris worker." "She waited 400 years for the right person," I said. "The job was incidental." Osrin almost smiled at that. Almost. The weight of the room was too much for a full smile, and we both understood that, and the almost was enough. I put my hands back on the contact surface. The Ardenvast held her steady tone beneath everything, beneath the rain beginning on the hull above us, beneath the deep root thread hum moving outward through Kethara's crust, beneath Osrin's quiet breathing beside me, and the script running gold on the walls and the clouds building on the display above the western plain. The tone was not triumphant. I had expected something more like triumph, after 411 years of waiting. But triumph requires an audience, and the ship had not been waiting for an audience. She had been waiting for the work to begin. The work had begun. I sat in the chair that had been built for me, the founding line, the genetic key, the woman who had liked soil and had passed that forward without knowing what she was passing, and I watched Kethara learn to be alive again, and the weight of what I now was settled into me the way water settles into soil that has been dry for a very long time. Completely, without resistance, as though the soil had been waiting for exactly that. I thought about the contract. 12 weeks, Delvern salvage, debris clearing. I was technically still employed. The work order on my handheld still listed 23 items outstanding on the field clearing schedule. I thought about what those items meant now. The remaining equipment frames in the northeast quadrant, the sorting schedule for the hull panel stacks, the loading coordinates for the crawler's next run. I thought about filing the shift report for today, which would require describing what had happened, and I thought about the form the report was structured around, which had been designed for debris clearing operations and had no section for this. The rain was steady now. Not heavy, patient. A working rain, the kind that commits to the soil rather than running off it. The display showed the clearing surface darkening uniformly as the moisture reached the upper layer, and beyond the clearing, on the southern plain where the ancient colony had first put down roots, the same dark spread was visible from orbit, the activated soil accepting what it had been waiting to receive. The Ardenvast's tone held beneath it all. Not louder, not changed, simply present, the deep clear chord of a system doing what it had been built to do after 4 centuries of holding itself in readiness. She had not changed in those 4 centuries. She had maintained her systems, maintained her record, maintained her patience, maintained the core against the day when the day would come. I had cleared debris from her approach field for 5 weeks and had felt nothing extraordinary about any of it. Had walked along her hull every morning to reach the northeast quadrant, and had thought about her only as the most impressive thing I had ever seen, which was true, but was also approximately 1% of what she was. The other 99% had been waiting for a morning when the wind was quiet, and I came out early and reached for a tool I had left behind. Osrin was talking on the comm now to the station, to someone above her in the Delvern structure, her voice low and controlled, and carrying that quality of a person who is delivering information they understand, will require a complete restructuring of the situation on the other end. I listened to half of it. The half I listened to was the part about the terraforming projection. The 8 years to viable agriculture, the 25 years to atmospheric balance, the 40 years to full planetary coverage. Those numbers were landing hard on the other end of the comm. I understood why. Those numbers meant Kethara was not a dead boneyard world on a salvage contract anymore. Those numbers meant Kethara was a colony world again, in the process of becoming something, with a timeline and a trajectory and the kind of investment horizon that redirected enormous resources in a very short time. I was not thinking about resources. I was thinking about the woman whose name meant groundkeeper, who had designed a system of such patience and such precision that it had held intact for 4 centuries on a dead world waiting for a single specific person, and who had died in the first winter before she could activate it herself. I did not know her name in any language I spoke. I did not know her face. I knew that she had liked the feel of soil, or if not her, someone in the line between her and me had liked it, and had passed that liking forward the way the key had been passed forward, without knowing its weight, as a simple human preference that had nothing to do with anything important and had, it turned out, everything to do with everything. That was the inheritance, not the title, not the legal right to the core, which the station archives lawyers would spend the next several years working out, and which Osrin was already beginning to establish on the comm. Not the genetic key, which I had carried my whole life in every cell of my body without knowing I was carrying anything. The inheritance was the preference, the pull toward a thing without a reason that you could articulate, the feeling that this is right in a way that has nothing to do with logic. My mother in her kitchen garden on the building roof, hands in the containers, doing a thing that made no practical sense for someone in her circumstances, and that she did anyway because she liked the feel of it. The groundkeeper had known, when she engineered the key into the founding line, that she could not predict who would carry it. She could not predict what that person's life would look like, what their circumstances would be, whether they would be a colonist or a debris worker or anything in between. She could not give them the knowledge because the knowledge would be lost in 4 centuries of dispersal. She could not give them the purpose, because purpose without knowledge is indistinguishable from aimlessness. What she could give them was the inclination, the quiet gravity toward the right thing without a reason. A preference for soil, for open sky, for the surface of a world rather than a sealed space underground. The inclination to stay close to the ground. I had worked 9 worlds. All of them had been surface work. I had never taken an interior contract, never signed on with the underground operations that paid more and required less exposure to the elements. I had made that choice on every world, each time for reasons that had felt at the time like practical preferences. Better air, fewer accidents. I liked being able to see the sky. Those reasons were not false. But they were also not the whole story. And the whole story was sitting in the core chamber of the Ardenvast running golden script on the walls and holding a cord that was now, slowly and certainly, giving a dead world back to itself. The rain came down on Kethara. I sat with my hands on the contact surface and my eyes on the display, and the weight of what I now carried settled further into me with every minute that passed, not heavier, not lighter, but more fully present, the way you come to understand a thing not in the moment it is told to you, but in the hours after when the telling has had time to reach all the rooms in you. The founding line. The woman who had built this. The 11 people in the chairs who had tried and had not had the key. The 60-year-old remains near the corridor's end, close enough to almost. The 4 centuries of attempts logged in the station archive in the language of failure, each one true and each one missing the same single piece. The work light was still on above the hab unit door. My footprints in the clearing dust were washing away now, the rain softening the surface, the activated soil receiving the moisture and changing as it received, the fine gray-red dust becoming something darker and more complex, the first transformation of many that would make Kethara, in 8 years and 25 years and 40 years, into the world it had been built to become. It had been,